Hello, I'm Howard Green. Well, the so-called peripheral countries must have been biting their tongues today as the European Central Bank went ahead and raised its benchmark interest rate. Jean-Claude Trichet made good on his earlier indications he would raise rates in spite of severe sovereign debt issues in Portugal, Ireland, and Greece. Just this week, Portugal joined the other two in reluctantly asking for a bailout as funding costs for the government became prohibitively high. Joining us to discuss the ECB and the debt issues are, in Toronto with me here in studio, Alex Dershevsky, founder and managing partner at Recovery Partners, and from London, Jan Randolph, Director of Sovereign Risk at IHS Global Insight. Jan, let me start with you. First of all, is this rate hike by the ECB justified in your view?
Well, if you're German, it certainly is. That's the core dilemma the ECB is facing. Does it look to booming Germany, or does it look to the cold periphery, the countries that the last thing they want is a rise in interest rates? But given the politics of the situation, there's no way the ECB could not have done this. Ultimately, the ECB, European Central Bank, is born in the mold of the Bundesbank, and they are ultimate anti-inflation fighters.
So, Alex, are they really the Bundesbank?
Well, I think there's a political balancing act that the ECB has to play that makes it far more difficult for them to conduct policy than, say, the Bank of Canada and the Fed. As far as the rate hike goes, it's not going to change much. It's only 25 basis points. Rates had already moved that way. I think to adjust to the expectation of a 25 basis point hike. I think the larger question here is whether or not this represents a move to a policy that's going to rapidly tighten rates up to a normal level of around 3 to 4% that's consistent with 2.5% inflation. I personally don't think so. I think, as Jan mentioned, this was largely done to satisfy a desire in Germany for a symbolic rate move. They do have to balance this against the fact that they've got a brewing sovereign debt problem that hasn't been resolved yet.
So, Jan, do you share Alex's view on the trajectory of rates beyond this?
Yeah, I think this is a matter of principle, though, for the European Central Bank. As a central banker, most central banks would say they are, there to keep inflation low or have price stability. And certainly the ECB, European Central Bank, and the Bundesbank before it have a very good record, and they don't want this tarnished. What I think is important, though, is the principle that they are saying, we recognise inflation and we are on top of it, and we are ready to raise again should it get out of hand. At the same time, there's a separate avenue for the periphery countries to handle the situation with the bailout.
You could also argue, Alex, could you not, that the risk of inflation is as high or higher in the United States, yet the Fed has not moved there yet, still going ahead with quantitative easing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you've got a policy disconnect between Europe and the United States that's quite glaring, not only in the area of monetary policy, but also in the area of fiscal policy. And that's something that is going to impact global growth. It could contribute to a lot of volatility in markets. And, how this all shakes out in the United States is still very much up in the air. We've also got this looming budget deadline that's coming up fast tomorrow, April the 8th. We're not sure how that's going to work out. There are a lot of issues, a lot of balls in the air for policymakers to deal with. How this all ends up, resolving itself is still very much in question.
Okay, we are back talking about Europe. We were talking about the ECB rate increase. Now let's talk about these so-called peripheral countries. We've got Jan Randolph of IHS Global Insight in London, and with me here in studio in Toronto, Alex Dershevsky of Recovery Partners. Jan, back to you in London. How much does a rate hike like this, or perhaps subsequent ones as well from the ECB, hurt the peripherals, the Portugals, the Irelands, the Greeces?
That's a good question. Those already in a bailout fund obviously have a separate avenue for refinancing their debt through the governments, through the bailout facility, IMF and the Eurozone governments. And that's, they can control the interest rate there. That's separate from market rates. But it does affect Ireland, Spain particularly. If you think about all the householders with mortgages in Spain and Ireland, their mortgages are linked to the variable rate at the short end of the euro yield curve. So it's very, very sensitive to what the European Central Bank does.
The most problems with the housing sector of the peripherals.
Yeah, absolutely. And but at the end of the day, 25 basis points isn't going to push too many people offside. I mean, if it is, then you're already offside. But that is precisely why I said this is largely a symbolic act. I agree with Jan. They had to balance things, and one of the balancing questions against inflation is how this is going to impact on the personal sector and on the business sector that's taking down floating rate debt to finance its activity, or in the case of households, to finance their residences.
So Alex, just to follow up for you, do you see more risk for Spain now because of where Portugal is now, looking for a bailout?
Oh, absolutely. I think what we're seeing here is a crumbling of the economies in the periphery in terms of their debt management, their ability to service their debt. Their debt management strategies have failed. We're probably looking at a bond aid situation for Portugal. It's hard to see how the ECB can negotiate with a caretaker government on a restructuring package.
A bond aid?
Bond aid, yes.
Meaning?
Band aid, bond aid.
Okay.
We saw
With
what
rock
happened.
musicians? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, maybe it'll come to that. But we saw what happened in Ireland when they passed the package with what was in effect a caretaker government. They were going into an election, and immediately subsequent to the election, the whole package appears to be becoming unraveled. And it's the same thing in the case of Portugal. The Portuguese caretaker government has now asked for some support. The opposition has said, well, we think we're going to support that. Who knows what that means? The ECB have said, and the European Union have said, we are going to respond to this request with due care and alacrity. Well, who knows what that means? In the end, I think what we're looking at here is a tide over to the elections in Portugal, say June the 5th, I believe the elections are occurring. June 5th are when the elections are occurring. Between now and then, they've got about 12 to 15 billion euro of debt that's maturing, and I think we're looking at a patch that's going to tide them through this period of time until they get a more durable solution in place.
I'm a little bit more sober about Spain. I think there is now a firewall between Spain and all the others. I think Portugal is the last domino to fall, if I want to stick my neck out. And I think both Greece, Ireland, Portugal, they're so small, 2% each, 6% of Eurozone GDP, they are quite manageable.
So Alex, that's a little bit of a different point of view. There's a firewall, he says, between Spain and Portugal.
I
last domino was Portugal.
No, there's no such thing as a firewall here. I have to disagree, because what you have behind the governments is
Yields are falling in Spain.
Well, yeah, no, I don't see, perhaps, but I don't see a firewall being put in place in any way. Well, you can't firewall the interbank market. You've got a lot of interbank claims that run between Spanish banks and the rest of Europe.
At the end of the day,
yeah, and you've got 1.1 trillion of debt in Spain that's owed to three countries: Britain, France, and Germany. And,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and well, that's a substantial risk. That's how the contagion occurs, because that debt is not only owed to the governments; it's owed between banks. And the moment banks start to suspect other banks of being weak financially, they start to withdraw liquidity support from those banks, and the interbank market ceases to function, and it seizes up. That's how these things happen. So I don't see how you can firewall one country from another. If one of the Spanish banks is perceived to be in trouble, people are going to jump on that, and that could start another crisis.